On Monday, January 29th, 2018, a private jet lands at a quiet airstrip in Hampshire. On the surface, nothing seems out of the ordinary. A small crew, a few passengers, and a row of suitcases are unloaded onto the tarmac. But as officials start their routine inspection, something about the luggage raises a red flag. Fast forward to Wednesday, September 20th, 2023, 5 years later, and over 200 miles away. A different team of investigators closes in on a farm road in rural North Wales. An open trailer sits in the yard, with no traffic and no signs of life. There's just a feeling in the air that whatever was going on here has been happening for a long time and it's all about to come to an end. Two separate teams, two locations with seemingly nothing in common. Yet each was hiding a secret that would ultimately draw investigators straight to them. This is the story of how a luxury flight into Farnborough and a remote farm near Mold, Caen, one making Lingdon Stations, became the center of two of the most significant trafficking operations exposed in modern UK law enforcement history, and how they both finally unraveled. Welcome to Echoed Crimes. Let's dive right into the case. Before their names ever hit the headlines or appeared in court documents, the four men at the heart of this operation were, by all appearances, just regular guys, living ordinary lives. Martin Neal, from Poole in Dorset, worked as a bricklayer. He had an ongoing construction project at Sandbanks and was known around town simply as a contractor who took on building jobs. Alessandro Iembo, at 28, was the youngest of the crew. He worked shifts at a Wetherspoons pub in Bournemouth and also delivered for a local pizza place. Victor Franco Lorenzo, originally from Spain but living in Bournemouth, had worked various jobs in the service industry. And José Ramón Migueles Botas, the oldest at 56, was a hairstylist from Valladolid who traveled between Spain and the UK for work. Nothing about their jobs, their lifestyles, or daily routines even hinted at international crime. The group crafted a persona built on wealth, tech startups, and the music industry. It was a cover designed to make their movements look completely legitimate. At the center of this plan was a woman calling herself Claire Harris. She contacted a private jet company, Diamante Jets, claiming to represent wealthy clients involved in cryptocurrency and music industry projects. She chartered jets for them, always insisted on using specific ground handling companies, and paid for everything in cash. We'll break down each operation one by one. Their decision to use private jets was strategic, a way to avoid the intense scrutiny at major hubs like Heathrow or Gatwick, which are known for high passenger traffic and large customs teams. Instead, the group repeatedly chose Farnborough, a smaller airport catering to business and executive travel. Now, Farnborough did have border force agents, but not nearly on the scale of the major airports, and this kind of vulnerability is a known issue across the UK. There are over 3,000 small airstrips, many of which operate with minimal on-site security checks. Criminal organizations often see these smaller airports as soft targets, easy entry points for high-value cargo or discreet movements. But the crew's ordinary lives and fake identities were just the tip of the iceberg. Within weeks, their first dry run would reveal the true extent of their planning and just how far the network would go to stay off the radar. The events of early December 2017 would later be seen as a dress rehearsal, the first full-scale demonstration of how the operation planned to move its product, cash, and personnel between the UK and Colombia without drawing any unwanted attention. On December 8, 2017, 3 members of the crew, Alessandro Iembo, Victor Franco Lorenzo, and Martin Neal, took off from Luton Airport on a private jet paid for entirely with cash. The arrangements were once again made by the woman known as Claire Harris, with Claire Harris, and came to a total of roughly £128,500, all paid up front. She also insisted that a specific Colombian ground handling company, Central Charter, manage the aircraft once it landed in Bogotá. For investigators, this demand would later become a critical clue. pointing to careful coordination with their associates on the ground in the UK and their counterparts stationed in Colombia. Notably, José Ramón Migueles Bultas was absent from this particular trip. The fact that Migueles Bultas wasn't on this dry run would prove significant later, highlighting how roles could change between flights and suggesting the December trip was a proof of concept rather than a full-blown operation. The flight path itself was also remarkable. The return journey included a stop in the Azores, a detail that stuck out when investigators later compared it to standard private jet routes between Colombia and the UK. But the destination and the cost weren't the most important parts. What truly mattered was what went down when the men landed back in Britain on December 11th at Farnborough Airport. A chauffeured Rolls-Royce Phantom was waiting for them, a touch that perfectly reinforced their fabricated cover as cryptocurrency investors and music industry bigwigs supposedly in town to meet the singer Bruno Mars. From the airport, they headed to an address in Bromley, hauling multiple suitcases with them. Not a single one was checked by Border Force officers. There was no inspection, no interruption, no detection whatsoever. The group sailed right through. It wasn't until months later, as investigators pieced the trip together, that they found X-ray images from Colombia revealing suitcases stuffed with huge amounts of cash linked to that December flight. These images didn't come to light during the actual trip. They were only recovered after the arrests in January, and they provided crucial evidence that cash had most likely been smuggled out of the UK. If that was the case, it meant the December journey wasn't just a reconnaissance mission, but a massive cash exchange directly tied to the smuggling conspiracy. That quiet December flight proved the route was viable. What came next in January would push the very same method to its absolute limit, with new players, more baggage, and much higher stakes. By late January of 2018, the crew had already confirmed that a private jet could make a full round trip to Bogotá without drawing any real heat. This time around, every single stage of the preparation was more calculated, more organized. On January 25, 2018, José Ramón Miguel Espadas flew from Spain to the United Kingdom and checked into a Premier Inn in Bournemouth, near where both Martin Neal and Alessandro Yemba lived. That very same evening, the entire crew made their way to the Chelsea Harbour Hotel in London. The hotel stay, much like their use of luxury cars and upscale transport, all played into the elaborate story they were carefully building. On January 26th, a fleet of luxury cars pulled up to the hotel to take the group to Luton Signature Airport. These vehicles were loaded with the men and a suspicious amount of luggage, a total of 12 suitcases, way more than you'd expect for a short trip abroad. Investigators would later point out that the sheer volume of luggage, by itself, should have been a red flag, showing just how much the operation depended on pure bravado and showmanship. Meanwhile, the arrangements for the second flight were already locked in. The booking was an almost perfect copy of the December run, roughly £138,500, paid in cash, and was set up by the same woman, using the same cover story and the same handling company upon arrival. This suggested that whoever was running the Colombian side of the operation insisted on using a specific ground crew. When the private jet touched down at El Dorado International Airport in Bogotá, the mission was handed off to their Colombian conspirators. Now, El Dorado is one of the busiest airports in all of South America, but the crew's luggage seemed to move through a very strange and unofficial channel. Colombian authorities later found out that criminals in Bogotá had used a series of coordinated tactics to make sure the cargo slipped by without the usual inspections. One of the key elements was an airport ground handler who was allegedly on the take and whose access and authority allowed the whole operation to move forward, deep inside restricted areas. The suitcases themselves were reportedly transported to the aircraft in armored vehicles. This wasn't some casual thrown-together plan. This was a transport procedure normally reserved for high-risk transfers or extremely sensitive cargo. One of the most brazen details later uncovered by Colombian authorities involved a phony police officer who was even accompanied by a fake drug-sniffing dog. This imposter then conducted a sham inspection of the suitcases right before they were loaded onto the jet. The entire charade had one single objective: to create the illusion of a legitimate security screening and discourage any real officers from taking a second look at the luggage. Once the performance was over, the bags, now packed with hundreds of kilograms of product, were loaded back onto the plane as if they had cleared an official inspection. The contraband itself had been prepared and packaged well before the jet even touched down. Each 1-kilogram brick was wrapped with precision, made highly uniform, and stamped with cartel identifiers. Some were marked with the Superman logo, a symbol often linked to specific Colombian trafficking organizations. Others featured an Escobar imprint, which investigators believed was a clear nod to Pablo Escobar, or the wider legacy of the Medellin network. For investigators in the UK, understanding what took place in Bogotá was critical, as it revealed the true scale and deliberate nature of the conspiracy. When the jet finally departed from Bogotá, its suitcases were carrying a whole lot more than just clothes. The groundwork laid in Colombia was about to clash with the intense scrutiny waiting for them in the United Kingdom, signaling the beginning of the end for the entire operation. As the jet entered UK airspace on January 29, 2018, the men on board were confident that their plan was going off without a hitch, just like their successful run that previous December. However, this time was different. Border Force officers had already received a tip about the flight's arrival. Within minutes, they spotted several red flags that warranted a much closer look. The sheer number of suitcases, the conflicting stories from the passengers, and the intelligence surrounding their previous trip. The decision was made to conduct an enhanced search, and the group was escorted to a private inspection room. The events that transpired in that room would soon become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Upon opening the suitcases, officers first found a random assortment of women's and children's clothing, clearly planted there to create the appearance of a family vacation. But just beneath that thin veneer lay the true purpose of their trip: meticulously layered bricks, tightly wrapped in tape. A total of 513 individual 1-kilogram blocks of a certain white powder were uncovered. The purity level was around 79%, remarkably high for a shipment destined for wholesale distribution. The total weight was nearly a half-ton, a consignment with a wholesale value of roughly £15.39 million and a potential street value of over £41 million, according to official reports. Surveillance cameras captured the entire discovery from multiple angles, and these recordings would become some of the most widely seen images connected to the case, offering a stark visual confirmation of what had been a clandestine international smuggling operation. The moment that first block appeared on camera, the facade of a luxury getaway crumbled, and it became an undeniable, large-scale drug seizure. It was one of the largest seizures of its kind flown into the UK in years, and the critical turning point from which the rest of the case would unfold. By the time officers finished their search at Farnborough Airport, uncovering the shipment was just the start. What came next was the painstaking process of building an evidentiary case that prosecutors would later call clear, deliberate, and nearly impossible for the defendants to explain away. A huge part of this case was built on the electronic devices seized on the day of their arrests. Cell phones, travel documents, and records of their movements all came together to map out the group's deep involvement, long before that January flight ever took off. Among the confiscated items were multiple cell phones. Some were used for everyday communication, while others were clearly reserved for more sensitive conversations. The most significant find was an encrypted handset taken from Alessandro Yenbo. This device suggested a level of operational security typically associated with organized crime networks, not just four guys acting on their own. Even without access to the full message history, the mere existence of the phone bolstered the prosecution's argument that the group was taking orders from others, higher up the chain of command. Analyzing the call data provided the next piece of the puzzle, as investigators began to trace communication patterns between the men. covering the period from October 30th, 2017 to January 30th, 2018. The evidence started to come together, piece by piece, forming a clear picture. Their communications, travel patterns, behavior at airports, and the almost shameless way the luggage was presented, all of it came together to build a solid foundation for the case. A foundation strong enough to prove that the January seizure wasn't just an accident or some big misunderstanding. Instead, it was the climax of a meticulously planned operation. The case went to trial at Woolwich Crown Court in early 2019, where prosecutors began laying out the entire sequence of flights, bookings, and movements that orchestrated the entire smuggling ring. What unfolded during this phase of the trial was a systematic dismantling of the defendants' cover stories. One of the first stories the defendants tried to sell was that their trips had a charitable purpose. They claimed to be traveling on behalf of One Young World, a well-respected international charity. According to their story, their trip to Colombia was for youth-focused humanitarian work, but the prosecution quickly proved that One Young World had no record, no correspondence, no involvement, and absolutely no knowledge of any of these men. So, the defense switched gears to a more glamorous story, the idea that the men were part of the music industry, heading to Bogotá for a meeting with Bruno Mars. Investigators confirmed that Bruno Mars did, in fact, perform in Colombia during that December timeframe. But beyond that one coincidence, there was absolutely no evidence of a meeting invitation, backstage passes, a studio session, or any legitimate industry connection. No records tied the men to the event organizers or the star's management. The celebrity's name was dropped simply because it sounded believable. Alongside these big cover stories, a more personal defense was mounted for Stephen Neal, who had only joined the group for the January flight. His legal team argued he had no real part in the planning, had no clue what was being moved in those suitcases, and had no reason to be suspicious of the people who invited him. In the end, the jury agreed the prosecution couldn't prove he knew about the illicit cargo. He was acquitted. For the other 4 defendants, however, that line of defense didn't work. All 4 men were found guilty of the fraudulent evasion of a ban on a Class A substance, which covered their involvement in both the December dry run and the actual January smuggling attempt. Neal, Yambo, and Franco Lorenzo were each sentenced to 24 years behind bars. Since Miguel Botas was only involved in the final January flight and not the December rehearsal, he received a slightly shorter sentence of 20 years. But the verdicts in that courtroom didn't close the book on this case. Back in Colombia, where the bags were packed, authorities kicked off their own parallel investigation, leading to the arrest of 5 individuals, with the initial findings pointing to corruption and inside access at El Dorado Airport. For the National Crime Agency and Border Force, the case highlighted a dangerous vulnerability at smaller airports, the kind used mostly for private jets and not equipped for high-volume customs screenings. This made them prime gateways for organized crime. And, just as this case was wrapping up, investigators were already confronting a new operation, one whose sheer scale and boldness would challenge everything they understood about criminal logistics. On the surface, it just looked like another spike in the product hitting the streets of Britain's major cities. But behind the scenes, investigators were about to uncover something much, much bigger. This was an industrial-scale pipeline, engineered from thousands of miles away. Between May and September of 2023, a transnational network, with its command structure based in Dubai, quietly built a supply chain that snaked from South America through mainland Europe and deep into the UK's criminal underground. This wasn't just a single shipment or a one-time gamble. It was a non-stop conveyor belt, designed to supply Britain's market with unwavering reliability, massive volume, and surgical precision. According to later assessments by the Northwest Regional Organized Crime Unit, this network wasn't aiming for small profits or local distribution. Their goal was a sustained, nationwide supply, the kind of operation only the most elite criminal organizations on the planet can pull off. Their working estimate was staggering. A projected 2 to 3 tons of cocaine was set to flow through this pipeline. That's enough product to rock the wholesale market nationwide. Every long-running drug pipeline relies on a mule, someone who can slip across borders without raising any red flags. A person whose routine is so mundane, they become completely invisible. In this operation, that ghost was a 48-year-old man named Guy Remington. He was always alone, behind the wheel of a specially modified vehicle for his paralysis, pulling a small trailer. To any observer at the Eurotunnel terminals, he looked exactly like his cover story, a disabled man running a modest, consistent cross-channel business. But beneath that unassuming facade was the linchpin courier the whole operation was built on. Between May 3rd and September 21st, 2023, Remington made 9 separate runs through the Eurotunnel. Every single trip was a carbon copy of the last. He'd leave the UK, cross over to the continent, and stayed just long enough to make the drop, before returning with the same cool, predictable routine. And that very predictability was his best camouflage. To sell the story, he used a business front, a simple commercial cover that explained all the frequent travel, and why he was always hauling a trailer. But the real secret to the pipeline was hidden inside that very trailer. What appeared to be ordinary wood paneling on the interior actually concealed custom-built compartments that made the whole scheme possible. The construction was intentionally simple, just timber boards, screws, and woodwork that blended seamlessly into the trailer's frame. You could only access them by knowing the exact spots to press or pry, to get the panels to release. There were no fancy electronic switches, no welded false floors, not a single visible sign of tampering. Even a seasoned customs officer would have needed a solid tip to even think about tearing that trailer apart. And until that moment came, we could have not browned Seben.com. We'll circle back to that in a few minutes. While the couriers were running product across the border, the real engine of the UK operation was being set up in North Wales. It was at a place most people would never look twice at, Tir Lwyd Goch, a secluded farm tucked away on a narrow single-track road just outside of Holywell. To the average person, it looked like any other peaceful country property. An old farmhouse, weathered outbuildings, and fields rolling out to the tree line. But for Luke Hurst, the 37-year-old tenant who ran the place, Tir Lwyd Goch was way more than just farmland. It was the ideal hub for a massive cocaine distribution center. He was the point man on the UK side, the guy who turned a sleepy farm property into a central hub capable of supplying multiple major cities. Investigators would later describe him as the on-the-ground organizer, the coordinator, who made sure that whenever a shipment hit the UK, it had a secure place to land and a solid system to get it back out on the street. Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, and other major hubs were just a few hours' drive away, making it remote enough to stay hidden, but central enough to supply them all. But the real genius of the setup was their handover method. It was simple, low-key, and designed to keep Tir Lwyd Goch completely off the radar for anyone not in the know. Customers never actually came to the farm. Instead, the meets went down at neutral locations, like service stations along the A55 or on the quiet stretch of Pinfold Lane. Hurst, or another trusted crew member, would pick up a customer's car there, drive it back to the farm, load it up behind closed doors, and then return the vehicle to its owner at the same pickup spot. For months, the system ran like a well-oiled machine. If Tir Lwyd Goch was the heart of the operation, then the downstream networks were the arteries, pumping product out. A key player in that secondary layer was Thomas Smith, a Liverpool-based distributor in his early 40s. His role was less flashy, more methodical, but absolutely critical. Investigators would later discover he made frequent trips up to North Wales, showing up at pre-arranged drop-off points where cars were swapped for loading runs to the farm. But his involvement didn't end with the powder. What authorities eventually uncovered was something far more sinister, and we'll get into that in just a few minutes. Meanwhile, down south, another key player had a different but just as vital role. Morgan Towner, a 47-year-old courier from Surrey, who operated hundreds of miles from the Welsh base, but was still deeply connected to the network. His job was to handle the southbound shipments, transporting the product from the farm deep into the surrounding suburban areas and further. The van Towner used looked completely harmless, the type of vehicle you'd see parked in any contractor's driveway. But inside, authorities would later discover a professionally constructed hidden compartment so perfectly concealed that even trained search teams overlooked it initially. The connection between these men became crystal clear. Once investigators started extracting data from the seized devices, the phones held message threads mentioning drops, pickups, and precise countdowns that matched, down to the minute, the movements captured on license plate reader cameras and Eurotunnel records. GPS logs corresponded with known meeting spots, and calls bounced from tower to tower along the A55 and the M6, perfectly in sync with the routes tracked by surveillance and traffic cameras. Some messages were in code, others were barely hidden, but they all pointed in one direction: a coordinated operation where every man knew his part and timing was everything. The data from the devices did more than just fill in the blanks. It pieced the entire conspiracy together. It proved that Smith's trips were anything but random. For months, these distributors had kept the supply line running until one single mistake started to bring the whole structure into the light, and what was about to be revealed would show just how far this product had really traveled. For months, the Northwest Regional Organized Crime Unit had been tracking the movements of the man they believed was the key courier at the center of the operation. The pattern was undeniable. He was always towing the same modified trailer, outfitted with identical hidden wooden compartments. They had already documented 8 trips, but it was the 9th one that would change everything. On September 18, 2023, officers observed the familiar sight they had been anticipating: Remington leaving the UK by himself, pulling the same trailer behind his custom-fitted vehicle. The unit didn't just log the departure. They saw it as the final piece of the puzzle they had been piecing together. This was the moment investigators had been waiting for. They knew that stopping Remington at the border upon his return, 47, meant risking the entire network getting away. But letting him back into the country could lead them straight to the main distribution hub. And if they maintained surveillance, they could take down everyone involved in one single decisive strike. A plan was formed quickly. Track Remington as soon as he re-entered, follow the trailer to the farm, and move in the second the unloading started. If the network ran like it had for months, then the ground crew would be there waiting for him. And on September 20th, 2023, that's precisely what happened. Surveillance teams were already in place when the moment finally came. The trailer doors swung open, and the unloading process started. Within seconds, officers swarmed the location. The ensuing chaos signaled the complete collapse of the entire supply line. Inside the trailer and the farm buildings, investigators found exactly what they had long suspected. The whole operation was set up to bring in a massive shipment of high-grade narcotics. By the time the search was over, the final count came to approximately 505 kilograms of cocaine and about 108 kilograms of heroin, with a combined street value nearing £64 million. It was one of the largest single mixed drug busts the region had ever witnessed. Both Guy Remington and Luke Hurst were arrested right on the scene. But the takedowns didn't end there. In Remington's vehicle alone, officers recovered £183,865 in cash, all bundled and ready to be moved. Simultaneously, other teams were executing search warrants at his home and other related properties. Those raids turned up more than £700,000 in cash, multiple vehicles, and a collection of high-value assets that made one thing clear: he was no small-time player. This was a courier with serious connections, trusted to move some serious weight, and were paid handsomely for it. But even those figures were just scratching the surface of what investigators suspected the network was capable of. The Northwest Regional Organized Crime Unit's assessment, accessed, pieced together from travel times, text messages, known drop-off patterns, and the amount seized on the 9th run, indicated that the crew had already brought in between 2 and 3 tons of Class A substances on their previous trips, on the street. That translated to a potential value of over £250 million. The whole operation had been running like clockwork for months, but it ground to a sudden halt in a single morning, and the takedown of this pipeline was just getting started with that first arrest. Authorities closed in on the operation's other coordinator on October 18, 2023, when investigators made their next move in Liverpool. There, officers arrested Thomas Smith. A search of his residence turned up exactly the kind of cash they were expecting to find, along with about half a kilogram of cocaine and an extra 9,807 MDMA tablets, all packaged and ready for distribution. Ledgers and data from his devices linked him directly to the pipeline's operations, confirming he wasn't just a buyer, he was a key player in the network. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place on October 26th in Leatherhead, where Morgan Towner was taken into custody. His arrest shut down the last active supply line from the farm. By that point, the charges were clear. Remington was facing conspiracy to import Class A substances and conspiracy to supply Class A substances. Hurst, Smith, and Towner were all charged with conspiracy to supply Class A substances. Smith also faced additional charges for the MDMA and cannabis they seized. On November 2, 2023, at Chester Crown Court, all 4 men pleaded guilty. On March 21, 2024, the judge handed down sentences that reflected not just the 613 kilograms seized, but the sheer scale and sophistication of the entire operation. According to reports from the CPS and the BBC, the final sentences were as follows. Thomas Smith was given an 18-year sentence. Guy Remington also received 18 years. And Luke Hurst was jailed for 12 years, while Morgan Towner got 7 years for his role as a courier, bringing the combined total to 55 years behind bars. What are your thoughts on this case and the sentences handed down? Drop your opinion in the comments below. We'd love to know what you think. And if you found this investigation breakdown useful, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you won't miss the next episode of Echoed Crimes.